I was sitting at the table when Aisha said, "I'm leaving." I laughed once, nervous, and said, "Leaving where?" She didn't sit. She didn't soften her voice. "Leaving you." I stood up. "Did we fight? Did I miss something?" "You missed years," she said. "You're stuck." I said, "I'm trying." She shook her head. "Trying isn't moving." Rahil stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes hard. I looked at him. "You knew." He said, "I warned her." I swallowed. "About what?" "About you," Aisha said. "You're small. Comfortable. You hold me back." I said, "We planned this life together." She replied, "I outgrew it." I stepped closer. "Outgrew me?" "Yes," she said. "And I won't apologize." My chest burned. "We can talk. We can fix things." She said, "I'm done fixing." I reached for her hand. "I love you." She pulled away. "Love isn't enough." Rahil cleared his throat. "This is for the best." I snapped, "You don't get a vote." He said, "I get a responsibility." I looked at Aisha. "Say something human." She said, "I feel calm. That hurt more than shouting." I said, "So that's it." She nodded. "I already packed." I glanced at the suitcase near the door. I said, "You planned this?" "Yes," she said. "For months." I whispered, "While I slept next to you." She didn't answer. I asked, "Was there someone else?" She said, "That doesn't matter." "It matters to me," I said. She replied, "You'll survive." Rahil added, "You'll thank her later." I laughed again, broken. "You really believe that?" He said nothing. I said to her, "Look at me." She did, briefly. I said, "I would have changed." She said, "I needed you already changed." My voice shook. "I gave you everything I had." She said, "That was the problem." I stepped back. "So I'm not enough." She said, "Not for me." Silence filled the room. I said, "Do you remember our first night here?" She said, "Please don't." "I do," I said. "You said this place felt safe." She replied, "People grow out of safety." Rahil shifted. "Aisha, let's go." I said, "Don't rush her." She picked up the suitcase. I said, "If you walk out, don't come back." She paused. I wasn't planning to. I waited for tears. For hesitation. There was none. She opened the door. I said, "I trusted you." She said, "And I trusted myself more." Then she left. Rahil followed, not looking at me. The door closed. The apartment felt smaller. I sat down slowly. I stared at the empty chair across from me. I said, "She's really gone." No one answered. I touched the ring on my finger. I said, "What did I become?" The walls held our photos. The silence pressed harder. I realized this was the moment everything broke. I picked up my phone and said, "Aisha," into the empty air. I dialed her number. It rang once. Then voicemail. I said, "Please talk to me." The line went dead. I threw the phone on the couch and said, "Coward." The word echoed. I stood and paced. I said, "You promised." No reply. I walked into the bedroom. Her side was empty. I said, "You planned this while smiling at me." I sat on the bed. I said, "Was I that blind?" My voice sounded weak. I remembered her laugh. I said, "You said forever." I pressed my palms to my face. I said, "Rahil was right, wasn't he?" The thought made me angry. I said, "He never liked me." I imagined his stare. I said, "You judged me without knowing me." I stood again. I said, "I worked hard." The room stayed quiet. I said, "I tried to be enough." My throat tightened. I said, "Why wasn't I enough?" I looked at the door. I waited. Seconds passed. I said, "She's not coming back." That truth landed slowly. I whispered, "This is my breaking point." I sat on the floor. I said, I don't know who I am without her. I woke up and said, she's gone, just to hear the words out loud. The room didn't answer. I checked my phone and said, maybe she texted. Nothing. I typed, Aisha, please talk to me, and waited. The message stayed unread. I said, so this is silence. I sat on the edge of the bed and said, what did I do wrong? No answer came. I replayed her voice. You're stuck. I said, I was building. Her other words followed. You're small. I whispered, I was loyal. My phone rang. I said, Aisha. Imran laughed. Relax, Romeo. It's me. I said, I thought, never mind. He said, you sound terrible. I replied, I feel worse. He said, did you eat? No. Sleep? No. He sighed. I'm coming over. I said, you don't have to. I do, he said. Open the door. When he walked in, he looked around and said, damn, it feels empty. I said, she took the noise with her. He tried to smile. You'll survive. I snapped, stop saying that. He raised his hands. Okay, talk to me. I said, she blocked me. He asked, everywhere? Yes. He sat down. That's cruel. I said, she's already happy. He frowned. Who told you that? People, I said. Friends who aren't really friends. He shook his head. Social media lies. She's traveling, I said. Posting smiles. He said, that doesn't mean peace. I said, it means she replaced me. Imran leaned forward. You're not replaceable. I laughed. She did it easily. He said, you're letting her win. I replied, I already lost. He stayed quiet. I said, am I that weak? He said, you're hurting. I went to work late. Mr. Khurshid called me in and said, sit. I said, yes, sir. He looked at a file. Your focus is gone. I said, I know. He said, your work used to speak. I replied, I'll fix it. He asked, personal trouble? I hesitated, then said, my wife left. He nodded slowly. Pain shows in numbers. I said, I won't let it. He said, see that you don't. I returned to my desk and heard whispers. Someone said, that's the guy. Another voice said, she left him. I stared at my screen and said, ignore it. My phone buzzed. A mutual friend texted, she's doing great. I typed, good for her. My hands shook. I said, why am I shaking? At lunch, Imran messaged, you alive? I wrote, barely. He replied, meet me later. That night, I lay in bed and said, maybe she was right. The thought scared me. I said, what if I am small? The ceiling stayed quiet. I closed my eyes and saw her back. I said, don't walk away. She didn't turn. I woke up sweating. I checked my phone again. Blocked. I said, I wasn't worth a goodbye. I stared at my reflection and said, who are you now? The man looking back didn't answer. I sat in the dark and whispered, I don't know my value. The silence pressed closer. I realized this pain wasn't loud. It was patient, and it planned to stay. I heard my name before I saw them. He's the one, a voice said. I stopped near the copier and stayed quiet. Yeah, another voice laughed. Wife left him. Someone said, guess he wasn't enough. I clenched my jaw and said nothing. Imagine being dumped like that, the first voice added. I walked away and whispered, enough. At my desk, I stared at the screen. I said, they're right. The thought scared me. I heard a calm voice beside me. Are they? I looked up. What? Sarah stood there holding a file. She said, are they right? I shrugged. Everyone thinks so. She pulled a chair and said, do you? I said, she left. She replied, that answers nothing. I frowned. It answers everything. She said, no, it answers what she chose. I said, Same thing. She shook her head. You're hiding. I laughed softly. From what? From responsibility, she said. I stared at her. You don't know me. She said, I know self-pity. I snapped. I'm grieving. She replied, and enjoying it. That hit hard. I said, why are you like this? She said, because comfort won't help you. I stood. I didn't ask for advice. She stood too. Then stop acting lost. I said, everyone left me. She said, no one owes you rescue. I opened my mouth, then closed it. She handed me the file. You're behind. I said, I know. She added, catch up or drown. Then she walked away. I sat back down and whispered, who says that? I stared at the file. I said, she's right. That night, I walked home slowly. I said, no one is coming. The words felt heavy. I opened my door and said, this place is quiet. I looked at the mirror and said, you look tired. My reflection didn't argue. I said, I hate you. The words surprised me. I sat on the floor and said, why did you let this happen? Silence answered. I said, you begged. I remembered my own voice. Stay. Please. I'll change. I covered my face. That wasn't love. I stood and said, that was fear. I looked around and said, I'm done begging. My phone buzzed. Imran texted, how you holding up? I typed, I'm choosing something. He replied, choosing what? I paused, then typed, myself. He sent a question mark. I didn't explain. The next morning, I reached work early. I said, let's start. I opened tutorials and said, learn. Hours passed. My head hurt. I said, keep going. Sarah walked by and said, you're early. I replied, I'm awake. She nodded. Good. I said, you were harsh. She said, you needed it. I asked, why do you care? She answered, I hate wasted potential. I said, I feel empty. She said, fill it with effort. I stayed late. I skipped lunch. I said, focus. Days passed. I stopped checking my phone. I said, she's not my oxygen. One night, I reached for my phone and stopped. I said, no. I sat with the discomfort. I said, this hurts. I didn't run from it. At work, someone said, you're quiet. I replied, I'm busy. Mr. Kershid passed by and paused. He said, better. I nodded. Thank you. At home, I said, I'm tired. But it felt earned. I looked at the mirror again. I said, I don't like you yet. I leaned closer. But I don't hate you. That felt new. I lay in bed and said, I'm changing. No applause came. No message arrived. I said, good. I closed my eyes and whispered, this is my choice. And for the first time, I meant it. I stopped counting days and started counting results. Imran said, you look different. I said, I feel focused. He smiled. That's dangerous. At least it's quiet, I replied. At work, Mr. Kershid called me in. He said, sit. I sat and waited. He said, your numbers improved. I said, I worked. He nodded. You stayed late. Yes. You learned fast, he added. I had to, I said. He leaned back. I'm promoting you. I blinked. Seriously? He said, you earned it. I said, thank you. He said, don't waste it. I walked out and whispered, I won't. At my desk, Sarah said, congratulations. I said, you knew. She replied, effort speaks. I smiled. You were right. She said, about everything, I said. That night, my phone stayed silent. No celebrations. No messages. I said, this is fine. Imran called later. Drinks. I said, another time. He paused. You're always busy now. I'm building, I replied. He said, "Don't forget people." I said, "I'm learning who stays." He went quiet. At home, Amy called. She said, "You don't visit." I said, "I'm working." She asked, "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said. She didn't believe me. She said, "You sound distant." I replied, "I'm stable." She sighed. "Stability without warmth is lonely." I said, "I need this." She said, "Just don't lose yourself." "I won't," I promised. But I wasn't sure. Weeks passed. Friends stopped calling. I stopped checking. I said, "Growth is quiet." One evening, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Can we talk?" I turned. "Aisha," I said. She smiled lightly. "You look calm." I said, "So do you." She laughed. "I didn't expect that." "Why?" I asked. She said, "I thought you'd be angry." I replied, "I was tired." She crossed her arms. "You didn't message." I said, "I didn't need to." That surprised her. She said, "I wanted to check on you." I asked, "Why now?" She hesitated. "I heard you got promoted." I nodded. "Yes." She smiled again. "I always believed in you." I said, "That's new." Her smile faded. She said, "You don't have to be cold." I replied, "I'm not cold." She said, "Then what are you?" I thought, then said, "Present." She looked around. "This place feels smaller." I said, "I grew." She laughed nervously. "You're different." I said, "You left." She said, "I didn't come to fight." I replied, "Neither did I." She said, "I expected something." I asked, "Apologies?" Tears. She looked down. "Maybe." I said, "I'm listening." She spoke about stress, about pressure, about choices. I didn't interrupt. She stopped and said, "Say something." I said, "You sound tired." She frowned. "That's it." I nodded. "That's honest." She said, "You don't miss me?" I paused. "I miss who I was." She swallowed. "I thought you'd still need me." I shook my head. "I needed myself." Silence stretched. She said, "You're not asking me to stay." I replied, "I'm not begging." She looked confused. "You used to." "I know," I said. She picked up her bag. She said, "I don't recognize you." I said, "That's growth." She walked toward the door, then turned. She said, "This wasn't how I imagined it." I replied, "Me neither." She left. The door closed softly. I stood still. I said, "I didn't shake." My phone buzzed. Amy texted, "Did you eat?" I typed, "Yes." She replied, "Come home Sunday." I smiled slightly. "I will." I looked around the room. I said, "It's quiet, but not empty." For the first time I felt control. Not over her, over myself. And I didn't need to announce it. I just kept walking forward. I heard Rahil's voice and knew something had changed. He said, "I didn't think I'd ever call you." I replied, "Neither did I." There was a pause. He said, "She's struggling." I didn't ask who. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." He exhaled. "You sound calm." "I am," I said. He hesitated. "Things aren't working out for her." "With him?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "And with money." I leaned back and said, "That happens." He said, "You don't sound surprised." I answered, "I stopped being." He went quiet again. He said, "I judged you." I replied, "I know." "I was wrong," he added. I said, "That's your weight to carry." He didn't argue. He said, "She talks about you." I said, "I don't listen." He sighed. "I thought you'd enjoy this." "I don't," I replied. After the call, I stared at my phone. I said, "So it begins." At work, Sarah leaned over and said, "Big day." I asked, "How do you know?" She smiled. Your project made noise. Mr. Kershid gathered the team. He said, this was strong leadership. I nodded. Thank you. He added, clients noticed. People clapped. I felt nothing explode inside me. I said quietly, good. Later, someone said, we underestimated you. I replied, I did too. At lunch, Sarah said, you look distant. I said, I'm careful. She asked, about what? Believing applause, I said. She nodded. Smart. That evening, Aisha messaged me. She wrote, do you remember our old cafe? I stared at the screen. I typed, yes. She replied, I passed it today. I waited. She wrote, it made me think of us. I put the phone down. Minutes passed. She sent, you don't reply much anymore. I typed, I reply honestly. She said, I miss talking to you. I answered, we're talking now. She paused. Then she wrote, you sound cold. I said, I sound healed. She replied, that's not the same. I said, it's better. At work the next day, Sarah asked, she reached out. I said, yes. She said, and I didn't chase, I replied. She smiled. Good. I asked, am I wrong for that? She said, peace feels wrong to people who expect drama. That night, Imran called. He said, bro, everyone's talking. I asked, about me. About your rise, he said. I laughed softly. That's new. He said, enjoy it. I'm watching it, I replied. Another message came from Aisha. She wrote, I didn't think you'd move on so fast. I typed, I didn't move on. I moved forward. She sent, do you ever think about trying again? I stared at the words. I said out loud, no. I typed, I think about staying healthy. She replied, so that's it. I said, that's enough. She didn't respond. I sat in silence. I said, this isn't revenge. It felt important. At work, Rahil texted once more. He wrote, take care of yourself. I typed, you too. Sarah stopped by my desk and said, you're lighter. I said, I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. She nodded. That's karma. I leaned back and whispered, it's working. Not loudly, not cruelly, just steadily. And I didn't need to touch it. I let it whisper. I met her because she asked, can we talk properly this time? I said, we can talk. She sat across from me and said, you look steady. I replied, I worked for that. She nodded slowly. I didn't expect you to be okay. I said, I didn't expect to be either. She folded her hands. Things didn't go how I planned. I said, they rarely do. She looked down. I made mistakes. I waited. She said, I chased growth and lost peace. I replied, that happens. She looked up. You don't sound angry. I finished being angry, I said. She swallowed. I thought leaving would fix everything. I asked, did it? She shook her head. It broke more. I said, I'm sorry. She laughed sadly. You don't have to be. She leaned forward. I underestimated you. I said, so did I. She hesitated. I thought you'd fall apart. I replied, I did. She whispered, but you rebuilt. Yes, I said. Her eyes filled. I didn't think you'd outgrow me. I said, I didn't plan to. She wiped her face. I miss what we were. I answered, I miss who I was before I begged. That stung her. She said, I never wanted to humiliate you. You did, I replied. But I survived it. She looked away. I'm sorry. I nodded. I hear you. She asked, is that forgiveness? I thought, then said, it's acknowledgement. She frowned. What does that mean for us? It means honesty, I said. She leaned back. I expected a chance. I said, I expected respect. She said, I have it now. I replied, too late. Silence stretched between us. She said, I lost myself chasing more. I said, I found myself losing you. She looked at me carefully. Do you still love me? I breathed in. I care about you. She asked. But I don't need you, I said. That landed hard. She whispered, you used to. I know, I said. That scared me. She said, I didn't mean to be cruel. I replied, intent doesn't erase damage. She nodded slowly. I see that now. I said, growth shouldn't cost dignity. She looked down. I thought ambition made me strong. I said, it made you lonely. She smiled sadly. You sound wiser. I paid for it, I said. She reached for my hand, then stopped. She asked, if I asked for another chance? I met her eyes. I'd say no. Tears fell freely now. She said, that hurts. I replied, so did leaving. She wiped her face. I deserved that. I said, this isn't punishment. She looked confused. Then what is it? It's closure, I said. She took a deep breath. I really lost you. I said, you lost the version who would shrink for you. She stood slowly. I thought success would fill me. I said, it exposed you. She nodded. And you? I answered, it shaped me. She picked up her bag. I wish I stayed. I replied, I wish you grew with me. She paused at the door. You're stronger. I said, I'm complete. She whispered, take care of yourself. I said, I already am. She left without looking back. I stayed seated. I said quietly, that chapter is closed. There was no victory rush. No celebration. Just calm. I realized I didn't win against her. I won against who I used to be. And that was enough. I woke up and said, I'm still here. The room felt steady. I looked at the mirror and said, you survived. The man looking back didn't argue. At breakfast, Amy said, you're early. I smiled. I sleep better now. She studied my face. You're quieter. I'm peaceful, I replied. She reached for my hand. I worried. I know, I said. She smiled softly. I'm proud of you. Those words landed gently. At work, Imran said, you walk different. I laughed. What does that mean? He said, like you're not chasing approval. I nodded. I stopped. He leaned back. I miss the old you. I asked, why? He smiled. Because he needed saving. I replied, and this one doesn't. He raised his coffee. To growth. I clinked my cup. To peace. Later, Sarah sat across from me. She said, you look balanced. I asked, is that good? It's rare, she said. I smiled. You helped. She replied, you did the work. I said, I don't rush things anymore. She nodded. Neither do I. That felt right. Aisha messaged once. She wrote, I hope you're well. I typed, I am. Nothing more. No wait followed. I said quietly, boundaries work. That evening, Imran asked, do you ever regret it? I said, loving her. Yes. I shook my head. I regret losing myself. He nodded. You found him again. I built him, I said. At home, Amy called from the kitchen. She said, come eat. I joined her. She said, you laugh more. I replied, I forgive myself. She touched my cheek. That's growth. I thought about who I was. I said, I begged. I said, I shrank. I said, I blamed myself for someone else's choice. Those memories didn't sting anymore. At work, Mr. Kershid said, you're reliable. I answered, I learned. He nodded. Keep going. I planned my days carefully now. I rested without guilt. I worked without fear. I spoke without apology. One night, Imran asked, are you happy? I thought, then said, I'm content. He smiled. That's stronger. I sat alone later and said, she leaving didn't end me. The truth settled in. I said, it revealed me. I remembered the silence, the doubt, the nights I questioned my worth. I said, you didn't break. I breathed in and said, you adapted. Sarah texted, dinner tomorrow? I replied, I'd like that. No pressure. No expectations. Just presence. I stood by the window and said, I don't need revenge. The city lights flickered calmly. I said, my life speaks for me. I remembered Aisha's last look. Confused. Late. I didn't feel superior. I felt finished. I said, I don't win against people. I paused. I win against fear. Amy knocked gently. She said, you okay? Yes, I said. She smiled. I can see it. After she left, I sat down and said, thank you. No one answered. That was fine. I learned silence isn't empty. It's space. I filled it with intention. I filled it with effort. I filled it with peace. I said, I became the man I needed. And for the first time, that was enough.